Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Relationship and Truth. And today I'm going to do something that's a little bit odd for me. I'm actually going to be reviewing someone with whom I'm actually in great agreement on a great many issues, but on this one particular issue I don't agree with him that much. And his name is Dr. James White. I would recommend to anyone who is listening to this that if you are not already listening to Dr. James White's regular program, The Dividing Line, on the Alpha and Omega Ministries channel on YouTube, which is what I have pulled up right here, that you would listen to it and regularly listen to it because much of his stuff is awesome. And regarding God and the gospel, very solid. He's a fellow Reformed guy, so very solid in that regard. I'm more on the Presby side, so I have some issues with his take on baptism, but that's not what I'm going to be talking about this time. What I'm going to be talking about this time is a specific issue of translation, and this is not an area in which I would normally dispute Dr. White, given that Dr. White is the one that has all of the letters after his name, and I have far fewer letters after my name, and none of them are in Greek or Hebrew or Aramaic or anything like that, and so normally I wouldn't be going there, but this is one that I think the historical and textual evidence and lexical evidence kind of speaks for itself that this is a case not where, if Dr. White wants to believe what he does about this issue, that's fine. There are several people who do, but I just believe that he's being overly dogmatic and ignoring some things. And it is regarding the translation of Matthew 1:23. Which is a quotation from the Old Testament that says that the virgin shall be with child. On one of his recent Dividing Line episodes, like I said, that's what I have pulled up here, that's what I'm going to be reviewing. And just so you know the title of it, it was Mormonism and the LGBTQ movement, China's totalitarianism, Polite's confusion, open phones. That was the episode if you want to go ahead and look it up. And on that episode, he was basically trying to explain why Polite, this fellow who calls himself Polite, was wrong about the virgin birth. From what I can gather, and I do not know Polite at all, I've only heard about him through Dr. White here, but Polite believes that the virgin birth of Christ is basically a fabrication, if you will. And so Dr. White is responding to that because that is an obvious error that both Dr. White and I would agree on, that Jesus was indeed born of a virgin. He and I both agree on that. Polite does not. And so we're going to take issue with Polite here and say, no, you're dead wrong. That is not what the Bible teaches. You are incorrect, sir. However, I think in this particular case that Dr. White does miss the mark. Normally I would not review Dr. White's stuff, but this is, I would say, more of a learning opportunity for people in general to kind of make sure that they're getting all sides of an issue before they leap into it. And even as Dr. White himself has said, we shouldn't be true trusting of people with degrees after their name. Just because an authoritative person says it doesn't make it true. And understand that I say that with a great amount of respect. I've learned much from Dr. White over the years. I plan to continue learning much from Dr. White over the years. Like I said, he's on the Baptist side, I'm on the Presby side, so yeah, there's going to be that dispute. But I plan on learning from him and to continue to learn from him. But this is a case where I think that Dr. White kind of missed the mark on what was really the important issue and was not fair in his critique as he should have been. So with that introduction, which was a lot of introduction material, let's get into it. Key things to remember: Dr. White is an awesome guy. If you aren't subscribed to his YouTube channel and to his Facebook stuff, subscribe. And of course there's also Twitter, but I don't deal with Twitter because Twitter is just we won't get into that. But if you aren't subscribed to Dr. White's stuff, go ahead and do it. Alpha and Omega Ministries is a wonderful ministry, and if you can, support them. So there's that. We are fellow Reformed Christians. Yeah, we disagree on the baptism issue and stuff like that, but we're fellow Reformed Christians. Lots of common ground. This is one particular issue that in and of itself is not a make or break for the gospel. I am no way saying that Dr. White is a heretic or anything even close to that. All that I'm saying is that I happen to disagree with him in this particular area, and I want you guys to know that I disagree in this area so that you can think about these kinds of things and be aware of these things when it comes to biblical translation. That's it. All right? Are we good? All right. Let's play it.
Anyway, the point is, Alma in Hebrew, not in Greek. He's talking about a Greek concordance. First of all, it's not a concordance, it's a lexicon. What you need is a lexicon where you actually look up roots, meanings. You've got halo, and you've got you got older ones. You've got BD.
Okay, just like I said, reviewing as I go here. It's pretty obvious that Polite was probably using something like Strong's Concordance, and that's why he refers to it as a concordance. And this is actually a mistake that both Dr. White and I would agree is a potentially fatal mistake. If you don't actually understand anything about the languages, and frankly I don't understand much about Hebrew at all, my specialty is more in Greek, and I have taught basic, very basic introductory Greek courses. And both he and I would agree that if you're relying on something like Strong's Concordance without an understanding of language in general or that particular language, you're going to wind up with some really strange ideas about what the text says. And ultimately, what you're going to wind up doing is making the text say whatever you want it to say because you don't actually understand what you're doing. And so you're just going to find whatever makes the most sense to you. And lo and behold, when you're done, the Bible says exactly what you want it to say, which is a tad suspicious, don't you think? Yeah, well, that's the problem of relying on concordances and these other things when you don't have any understanding of how language works in general and of the specific language that you're dealing with. So Dr. White and I would be in a complete agreement on that one. Now, does that mean that you couldn't use Strong's Concordance at all? Not necessarily. If you have an understanding of the language and you know the limitations of a resource like Strong's Concordance, you could still get some stuff out of it. Now, if you really do understand the language, are you really going to need Strong's Concordance? Probably not. But I just want to make it clear that I'm not saying that you throw out the baby with the bathwater. What I'm saying is that the issue is, do you understand language in general and how translation and interpretation works, how language itself works? You know, taking a course in linguistics is actually something that I would suggest for every Christian. Seriously, take a course in linguistics, just so that you have an idea of how language works in general, so that translational issues and these kinds of things make more sense to you and you understand where things are coming from. I think Dr. White and I would be in agreement on that. And that's not the issue of dispute. Okay.
DB, you've got Kohler, Baumgartner, there's all sorts of Hebrew, Aramaic lexicons. And then when you're talking about a Greek lexicon, you're not talking about a concordance with numbers. No serious scholarly lexicon has numbers, so you can just sort of do the numbers thing. It sort of assumes that if you're going to be doing this kind of stuff, you might want to know the language, you might be able to read it or something like that, at least to a certain level. And so, if you're looking at Greek lexicons, you know,
I just want to say, as kind of a funny aside, not only did Dr. White just throw Strong's under the bus, he also threw Mounts under the bus, and also some of the things that have been put out by Hendrickson as well, because Mounts does a lot of his stuff for basic beginning learners with the GK numbers, and some of the stuff that Hendrickson has put out has had the GK numbers referenced in them as well. I just thought that was kind of funny, and I would agree that if you're relying on the numbers and you know nothing about the language itself, yeah, that's probably not where you want to go. But like I also said, understand this is not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Does that mean that you can't use the Hendrickson stuff that has the GK numbers in it? No. Does it mean that you can't use Strong's Concordance? No. Does it mean that you can't use the stuff from Bill Mounts, from William Mounts? No. Even though they have the numbers in it. What we're just saying, though, both Dr. White and I would both agree, is that if you're relying on the numbers and you don't know anything about the language, you're going to wind up confusing yourself. You're going to wind up gravitating towards the things that make sense to you, in which case the Bible's going to wind up saying whatever you want it to say. That's the point here. Got it? Okay.
You know, the standard Bauer, Donker, Art, and Gingrich, 3rd edition. But there are new...
I have that one, by the way, and it is awesome. It's kind of like the Oxford English Dictionary, but for the Koine Greek of the New Testament. Awesome resource to have, especially if you've had at least an introductory Greek course. I'd highly suggest that you get it. Very useful reference. Really expensive, though. It's like $160, but very useful.
Numerous others that are available, and so many of them now are available relatively easily, not overly inexpensive, but relatively easily obtainable in the various Bible programs, which are now available for your phone and your iPad and everything else. I use Accordance. They're available in Logos. There used to be BibleWorks. It's gone out of business now. You've got Olive Tree, and you can get these resources.
And yes, I was sad and also a little bit ticked off, if I'm going to be honest, about BibleWorks going out of business. Because down here you can see the little emblem for BibleWorks that I have. Love that little program, and I will actually be using it in this video, and I'm very sad that there are not further updates and support for it. That is just really annoying. But moving on.
Courses in all of these programs, and look these things up for yourself, and there you go. Anyway, so these are lexicons that you're going to be utilizing. And the area of confusion, other than the language that the gentleman has, is that there is no question about the meaning of the Greek. He mentioned the Greek. He didn't mention the Hebrew. He mentioned Matthew 1:23. And in Matthew 1:23, it's hey Parthenos. Now Parthenos, you have the Parthenon in Greece. There is no question about its meaning. There's none. The whole point of these temples were the Vestal virgins that were there, and the term has very specific meaning of a virgin.
Okay, that is where I take issue with Dr. White. I understand what he's trying to do here. There's someone who is denying the virgin birth of Christ and is not utilizing the best scholarship in the world, because let's face it, if you're relying on a number system because you don't really understand the language, you probably shouldn't be commenting on the language. Okay, that's a fair critique. But where I disagree with Dr. White here is that he is adamant in saying that the Greek word Parthenos has a very specific technical meaning of virgin. And he brings up the Parthenon, and he brings up a lot of the things that come from Greek culture in which Parthenos is used very specifically of someone who has never had sexual intercourse. And I get where he's coming from on that, and a lot of textual scholars would be on the same page as him. But when he is so adamant in saying that this is the only view regarding that word, that he says there is no question that this is what it means. And that I have to take an issue with, because this is something that actually I was at one point curious about, and so I studied it out, and I found out that there is not complete unanimity on that one, and there's actually good reason for why not. There's not complete unanimity on that one. And this goes back to linguistics again. And there's some similar related issues that happen other places in the New Testament, and what it really has to do with is the issue of synonyms and regions. And to use an example that you might be aware of, for those of you at least who are American, I know some of my people who listen to this channel are not American. For those of you who aren't, bear with, but in America, we of course will sometimes have different words for things. And sometimes you can get different words that actually refer to the same thing. One of these areas where you can get multiple words that refer to the same thing is in the area of sweetened carbonated beverages. Some places in America will call it soda. Some people will call it pop. Still other places will refer to the whole thing as Coke. It depends on where you're from. And if you're in an area that has influences from multiple regions, you might wind up using all of them. For example, I'm from Idaho, and in Idaho we will say both pop and soda. Personally, soda is a little bit more natural to me, but I've said pop before when I want a carbonated beverage to drink, and I've said soda before, and that is just fine. And that's normal for, even within a language, for specific regions to take on different words and use them kind of with their own flair. And what is interesting is that in the course of time, sometimes those words will take on a highly specific meaning, and sometimes they'll be general. Take Coke, for example. In certain regions of the United States, Coke is a very general term for a carbonated beverage, usually one of the darker colors. But where I'm from, Coke refers specifically to a Coca-Cola product. It's basically a brand name. It's used with reference to a specific brand. But in other regions of the U.S., if you ask for a Coke, you're asking for a soda in general, and they'll say what kind. Where I'm from, if you ask for a Coke, they're going to hand you a Coca-Cola. And that's the same thing that we have going on with Parthenos in Greek. You have different regions using this word, and different regions use it differently, which is not all that surprising. That's language in general. A basic study in linguistics kind of helps cue you into some of these kinds of things, and that's why when I first was looking at the issue, and this was years ago, I was a little bit sensitive to that because for my education degree I had to study linguistics, and so I was very well aware that different regions will sometimes use the exact same word but in different ways, sometimes generally, sometimes specifically. And so when I looked at the word Parthenos, I found out that that's actually what was happening. In Gentile cultures, we'll use the biblical language here, Gentile versus Jewish culture. In Gentile cultures, Parthenos, like Dr. White said, is very specific. You have the Parthenon, you have the temple virgins and all these kinds of things. It is very, very specific terminology. Like where I'm from, if you ask for a Coke, they're going to give you a Coca-Cola product. It is specific. It is this thing. But what's weird is that when the Greek language came into the Middle East, how it was used in the Middle East wasn't the same. Instead, it became a fairly general term that would be interchangeable with other terms. In the Septuagint, for example, sometimes you'll have the same underlying Hebrew word, but the Greek words that get translated from it will actually be different Greek words that they use interchangeably. One of the Greek words is neamis for the Hebrew word alma, and the other one is very frequently Parthenos. And the Septuagint translators would flip between the two without any reference to the underlying text. They use them completely interchangeably. And so that's not really reasonable to say that they're trying to use it in the same way that the Gentile culture was, any more than saying that the people who use Coke as a general term for any carbonated beverage, usually one of the darker ones, like Coca-Cola or Pepsi or something like that, one of the darker ones, to say that one necessarily has to be the interpretive lens for the other is a major linguistical problem. That is not valid linguistically speaking, to use one region's interpretation and one region's definition when you're trying to interpret and translate a text that comes from a completely different region, from a completely different culture. Yes, they have the common Greek language, but they have different dialects and certainly different emphases and different registers and different overall usage patterns. Like I said, very similar to how Coke can be used in America. It can be specifically Coca-Cola, or in some places it's a very general term. Almost any carbonated beverage. Very different uses. If you're talking about Parthenos in Greek, and you're talking about specifically Gentile cultures that are using these words in conjunction with the Gentile culture of having these temple virgins and these kinds of things, yes, Parthenos would be specific to someone who had never had sexual intercourse, to a virgin in the sense that we would think of one. But when you look at Semitic literature and Jewish literature and literature from the Middle East that is written in Koine Greek, and you compare it, and you compare the usage, they don't differentiate between terms like Parthenos and Naonis. They use the two terms interchangeably, and if they want to talk about specifically someone who is truly a virgin, they will actually go and they will add extra descriptive material saying the Parthenos who had never been with a man, to say that this person was sexually pure. Parthenos in and of itself wasn't enough to define that, and there are terms even in the Septuagint where that happens. And this is taking over from the Hebrew translation, which basically does the same thing, because the Hebrew, yes, there are terms specific in Hebrew that can specifically reference virgin, but not as commonly. A lot of times in the Hebrew, they'll go ahead and they'll give the extra explaining material. And they kept doing that when they translated it into Greek. They would keep the extra explanatory material, and they didn't let the word itself stand in for the entire concept. They did not take Parthenos as being a specific virgin in the sense that we think of virgin as automatically means someone who is sexually pure. And so you have two different regions using the word in two very different ways, just like the word Coke in English. In some places it's very specific, in some places it's very general. And when you're interpreting a work, you have to step back and say, okay, at that time and place, how were they using it then? And you can't interpret it through the rest of Greek and Gentile culture. It doesn't work that way. Language itself doesn't work like that. That is a very linguistically, and understand that I do greatly respect Dr. White, but that is a linguistically inept way to translate it. And frankly, I'm not the only one who's ever felt that way. Now, granted, I am in the minority because a lot of people don't run things through as much analysis as I do. Frankly, yeah, I do. I overthink things sometimes. But my college training, such as it was thorough, in that you need to make sure that you look at everything appropriately, and you need to make sure that you make differentiation where differentiation is required. And this is one of those cases. But like I said, I'm not the only one who's ever thought of these things, and people like me do tend to be fairly rare, but it is worthwhile noting that some very notable people have likewise questioned and even gone so far as to say that in Matthew 1:23 that it should not be translated as virgin there. That was not what the Septuagint translators were trying to convey. They were just simply using it like they used the term in the rest of Semitic literature, and in other places in the Septuagint even, where it was interchangeable with Naonis, where it was simply a young woman of marriageable age. One of the most notable people that I would put on the list of people who would say that Parthenos is not necessarily specific to a virgin when it's in Semitic usage, when it's in Jewish usage, when it is coming from that biblical worldview, when it's coming from the Middle East, would actually be William Tyndale. You know, the guy who was basically the first to translate the New Testament into English, that William Tyndale, yeah, he didn't think that the word Parthenos translated as virgin in Matthew. He understood that Matthew was writing from a Middle Eastern dialect, from the Middle Eastern usage to people who were Middle Eastern, from a Jew to Jews. And so he understood that interpreting it in a way that was specific to the Gentiles was not be appropriate. And he knew that in the Jewish literature, Parthenos was not necessarily a specific term. And so when he translated Matthew 1:23, he didn't say virgin, he said maid. Now, what I've pulled up here is the 1537 Matthew's Bible, which uses the Tyndale New Testament. And over here on the side, follow the cursor, it says, "Behold, a maid shall be with child, and shall bring forth a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which is by interpretation God with us." Behold, a maid shall be with child. Okay. Tyndale understood it as maid, and that's going all the way back to the 1500s. And like I said, other people along the line have noticed this. Not everyone has made that distinction. Okay, not everyone has tried to differentiate out the usages between Gentile usage and Jewish usage. Not everyone has done that, but those people and translators, those lexicographers and translators who have made the distinction, have recognized that virgin is not the best translation for Matthew because it was from a Jew to Jews, and so it wouldn't be used in the way that it would be used in other places. For example, if this quotation had occurred in the Gospel of Luke, I would be much more hesitant about saying that, it should probably be made. And the reason why is because Luke was written to a Gentile audience, and so its verbiage is, while it shows a great amount of Semitic, of Jewish influence, it would have been more so geared towards a Gentile audience, and so it would be hard to be as adamant about that. But in Matthew, where it's from a Jew to Jews, it's fairly clear. And like I said, Tyndale picked up on that. And that's all the way back in the 1500s. Another person who picked up on that was Alexander Suter, who noticed that the usages for this word differed between Gentile groups and Jewish groups. And so in Alexander Suter's works, and he wrote during the turn of the last century, so going into the early 1900s, when he wrote his lexicon, he actually specifically put in there that in the case of Matthew, of the Matthew quotation, that it should be maiden, which is very similar to Tyndale's maid. So you have Tyndale saying maid, you have Alexander Suter saying maiden, and then very recently you have a lexicon that comes out by the Fribergs, and it actually was 2005, that's what this is. And I'm sorry, you guys probably cannot see this very well. You might have to enlarge the screen to get it to show, but it's copyright 2005. And I actually have this one in BibleWorks. I don't usually carry a big old lexicon with me, but I have this one in BibleWorks, so I thought I'd go ahead and bring it up for you. So I have Matthew 1:23 here, and I also have it in the Tyndale New Testament as well, where it has the maid. But the Greek is what we're interested in, so Parthenos. And in the Friberg Analytical Greek Lexicon, the first meaning that it lists is as an unmarried young woman. Can be virgin, but also maiden, and even the general term girl. Okay, it is, even in Friberg's thinking, it's not specific to someone who actually has not had sexual intercourse. It can be more general than that. And he does list other uses, and he does specifically mention not having sexual intercourse, that it can be chaste and pure, so on and so forth. But the very first definition that he lists is unmarried young woman, which by implication could mean virginity, but it could also be maiden and girl. Now, does this at all prove that Polite was correct, that the virgin birth is made up? No. All that I'm simply saying is that there are many people throughout history who have done good, solid lexicography and who have been very linguistically sensitive to the fact that the same word can be used in different ways by different groups of people, just like the word Coke. Where I'm from, if you ask for a Coke, you're going to get a Coca-Cola. Other places, if you ask for a Coke, they're going to say what kind. Same thing here. Parthenos in the Middle East at the time of the Septuagint going into the New Testament, it was used interchangeably with other terms that were more specific and less specific. It was just seen as one of a host of synonyms. You asked for a Coke, you asked for a soda, it's the same thing. But in a specifically Gentile audience, though, it would have had a much more specific usage. It specifically referred to virgins in the sense that we would think of as being sexually pure. Does that mean that Brother Polite is correct, though? No, because that is not what the New Testament in general says. The New Testament, even there in Matthew, goes to great lengths to state that Joseph had no intercourse with Mary. In the Gospel of Luke, Mary specifically says, "How can this be, since I've never been with a man?" The biblical text goes out of the way to say that Mary was a virgin at the time of conception and following conception. That is, up until Jesus was born, Joseph never had any union with her. Nor did anyone else. He said, "How can this be, since I've never been with a man?" The text goes out of its way to explain that, in fact, Mary is a virgin. There is no doubt about that, because the text specifically states that. What I have a problem with is Dr. White saying that the term Parthenos specifically means virgin, and therefore Polite is wrong. No. The term Parthenos can mean young woman, and there have been good, godly Christian translators who have translated it as maiden, including William Tyndale. William Tyndale was very much so an Orthodox guy. He very much so believed in the virginity of Mary, that Jesus was, in fact, born of a virgin. And as to his doctrine and theology, very, very, very sound guy. If you've ever read a Tyndale New Testament and read his commentary on Romans, you know he's a solid dude. He really is. And he's completely Orthodox, and yet he still translated it as maid. He could have translated it as virgin, but he chose not to because he was being linguistically sensitive. And Tyndale really was ahead of his time when it came to a lot of issues of translation. He was one of the first people to actually produce a dynamic translation, one that was meant to be fairly understandable to the common person. But at the same time, he was remarkably precise in a lot of cases, even more precise than some of the big name translations that came later. For example, Peter talks about our God and Savior, Jesus Christ. And in big name translations that came later, like the King James, it doesn't translate that very clearly, that Jesus is both our God and Savior. But William Tyndale did make that exceptionally clear in his translation, that Jesus is our God and our Savior. Tyndale was one really smart guy, especially for being as far back as he was, early 1500s, and yet he correctly translated the Granville-Sharp's rule, even where the King James translation got it wrong. And he's also being very linguistically sensitive here. He's understanding that, there's regions that are going to use sometimes the exact same term but in different ways. He's picked up on that and did that. And people who knew William Tyndale just knew that about him. He was a tinkerer. The reason why he didn't get around to translating the entire Bible, which was actually his goal, and he started doing the Old Testament. He got some Old Testament books translated. But the reason why he never finished was because he was a tinkerer. He kept putting out new editions of the New Testament rather than just simply saying, okay, I'm done with the New Testament, work on the Old Testament. He liked to tinker. He wanted to find things that really worked well, and he wanted to make sure that it was as accurate as he could be. And even though he's really old, I find it really useful to look at his translations. Now, textually, I don't think that Tyndale's translation is as strong as others, because we have discovered so many more manuscripts since the time of Tyndale. And so I don't agree with some of the textual readings that Tyndale's New Testament would have, but that's mostly just because of ignorance. He only had so much available to him. I mean, it was basically Erasmus's Greek New Testament that Tyndale had at the time, and so that's what he used. Very limited resources there. But for what he had, man, he did a thorough job, and a very caring and very accurate job. And people who've looked at his work since then, and not just his work, but just looked at the language in general and say, how is this word being used, like Suter and like the Fribergs? They notice that, that actually is a valid reading, and it could actually be made. And I would argue, as did Suter, that maiden is actually the best translation at Matthew 1:23, going from a Jew to a Jewish audience and using the term like they would use it, which seemed to be interchangeable with a bunch of other terms which were not specific to sexual purity, but just rather to being of a marriageable age or rather young. because like I said, in the Jewish literature, and especially in the Septuagint, it gets interchanged with naonis all the time. And if you're sensitive to that, you wouldn't make the argument that Brother Polite is wrong because Parthenos must mean virgin. No. Brother Polite's still wrong. Don't misunderstand me. But it's not because Parthenos must mean virgin, and it's not even debatable. No, it's very debatable. Going all the way back to William Tyndale as far as English translation is concerned, and many lexicographers since then have made the point that, if you're going to differentiate usage, which you should do, linguistically speaking, there's really good reason to doubt that people from the Middle East actually used it in the same way that it was being used in Greece at the time. There were different patterns of usage. It's just like the difference between Coke and Coke. Does Coke mean Coca-Cola product, or is Coke a general term? Depends on where you're at. Same thing with Parthenos. Is it specific to a virgin, or is it a general term that basically just means young woman? Depends on where you're at. Greek proper, Gentile culture proper, it's a very specific term. But you take it outside of that context into the Middle East, into Jewish culture, and it doesn't retain that specificity. It becomes a much more general term at that point. But Brother Polite is still wrong, because in Matthew, the text goes out of its way to make sure that you know that Joseph did not have any union with Mary. In Luke, the text goes out of its way to let you know what Mary's reaction was. How can this be since I haven't been with a man? The text is very clear that Jesus was virgin born. Okay, so yes, Dr. White and I would agree on that. We're both Orthodox Protestant Reformed folks. But where I disagree with him is his absolute adamancy that Brother Polite, well, he calls himself Brother Polite. I really would not consider him a brother in Christ, because I have very little confidence that anything that he believes is within the pale of orthodoxy. But Brother White and I, Dr. White and I, we agree that Jesus was born of a virgin. But we agree on that for different reasons. I agree on it because the text goes out of its way to explain to us that Mary wasn't ever with anyone in that way. But Dr. White is doing it on the adamancy of a particular word that when you actually look it up in different lexicons, like Friberg's, like Suter's, and how it's even shown up in some translations like William Tyndale's New Testament, which wound up getting reproduced in the Matthew's Bible, when you actually look it up and how it's even been translated, you see that you can't make as strong an argument for it as Dr. White would like us to believe that you can. And like I said, Dr. White said, well, there isn't even a question. Well, there is a question. Why did Friberg say what Friberg did about it? Why did Suter say what Suter said about it? Why did Tyndale translate it the way that he did? The clearest explanation, especially in light of how it gets used in the Septuagint itself, is simply that the Jews didn't use it with that kind of specificity. They felt that it was interchangeable with naonis, which is just young woman in that context, just young woman. So I agree Brother Polite is wrong, but for a different reason, because the text goes out of its way to say that Mary maintained her virginity. Whereas Dr. White is being adamant about one particular word and saying, no, you need to look it up in the lexicons. And well, there are some lexicons that don't say that. Lexicons that are put together by linguistic people who have a little bit more sensitivity to some things than other people. There are different kinds of people that work with language. There are people who are on the linguistic side like me, and then there are people who are more on the grammar side. And most of the sources that Dr. White would look at would be ones that would be heavily influenced by the grammarian side of language analysis. I'm much more on the linguistic side. And so for me, I have absolutely no problem saying that should be translated as maiden there. That would be more accurate. And it has to do with basically looking at language from a prescriptive point of view or a descriptive point of view. That is, looking at grammarians look at language and they say, this is how it should work. whereas linguists look at language and say, how is it actually working at that time and place? And there's actually value to both sides. Because in order to say this is how it should be, to do the grammatical side, so you can actually form the rules and learn the language, you need to know how is it actually working. The two aren't opposed to each other, they work hand in hand. The problem, though, is that in the modern, the two have often become divorced just because the fields get so specialized. You know, there's not a lot of people that sit there with their copy of the Septuagint going through there and saying, okay, how do particular words in the Hebrew get translated over to Greek? You know, do we see these words being used synonymously, or do they use distinctly, so on and so forth? That's really tedious and boring. That's on the linguistic side. And it takes a lot of specialized time more than anything else. And because of that, you sometimes get some shortcuts that get made that become popular and well known. And, you know, there's evidence that can be cited, and as long as nobody significantly challenges it, it becomes mainstream. And that's what we see Dr. White falling into, is that he's relying on sources that are very much so on the grammarian side, not on the linguistic side, and because of that, we wind up disagreeing on that one. And by the way, just in case you were wondering what the Freeburg's qualifications were, this is who they are. Timothy Freeburg, or some people might say Freiberg or Freeburg. I say Freeburg. Probably mispronouncing it. But Timothy Freeburg and Barbara Freeburg are field linguists. You know why they picked up on this and other people don't always. And teachers of graduate linguistics working in Southeast Asia. Timothy holds a PhD from the University of Minnesota. Barbara earned an MA in linguistics at the University of Saigon and an MS in computer science at the University of Minnesota. And then Neva F. Miller, is that Neva? I'm not sure. F. Miller was a research consultant for the Summer Institute of Linguistics in Dallas, Texas. She taught Greek, Bible, and Christian education for 30 years at Bernard College in University Park, Iowa. So these are people who both know Greek and people who know linguistics, which is not something that you get from a lot of lexicons these days. Now, did Brother Polite know anything about any of that stuff? No. He picked up probably Strong's Concordance, thumbed through it, and found something that he happened to like, and he rolled with it. Completely taking it out of context, because in its context, you go literally just a few verses down, and even in Tyndale, and any translation you want to look at, it's going to say that Joseph did not have any union with his wife. He did not have any union with Mary until the time of the birth. It's going to be specific about that. And of course, like I said, if you look up the birth narrative in Luke, Mary specifically says, how can this be since I've never been with a man? Okay, so did Brother Polite really know what he was doing here? No, he just found something and he happened to latch on to it. So no, he's still not right. Sorry, Brother Polite, but you're still wrong. Jesus was indeed born of a virgin according to the biblical text. When you take the whole text in context, that's what you wind up with. But as to specifically, does Parthenos mean virgin, like Dr. White says? I don't think so. I think that when we're talking about going from a Jewish context to a Jewish context and understanding how that word was used in that particular environment, I don't think you can make that argument. Now, if we're talking about a Gentile context, certainly you could. But from Jew to Jew, Jewish context to Jewish context, not so much. And there are multiple people who would be with me in agreement on that. We wouldn't be the majority, that's true. But there are people who would point out that there is definitely a problem with saying that this word must be virgin. But that's not what Dr. White said. Dr. White said that it isn't even disputable, that this isn't debatable at all. That's not the case. It is disputable. Okay, so we'll play him out and let him get the last word here, and we'll finish up the video.
What he has heard and has strangely transmuted into something else is that Alma in the Hebrew can simply mean a young woman of marriageable age. And it could. But Matthew's not quoting the Hebrew, he's quoting the Greek Septuagint.
And this is where I think Dr. White is just misunderstanding what's going on. Polite very obviously doesn't understand what he's doing. There's very little to suggest here that he was actually thinking of the Hebrew Alma here. What is probably more likely is that he looked it up in Strong's Concordance for the Greek and found a source that said that Parthenos could mean maiden. As I pointed out, there are lexicons out there and resources out there that will give that as a translation for Parthenos.
Septuagint. And the Greek Septuagint uses Hey Parthenos. So before Jesus is born, 200 years before Jesus is born, the Jewish translators of Isaiah translated Ha'alma as Hey Parthenos.
Which, and it needs to be understood that in the Septuagint they translated Alma as not only Parthenos but also Neanis. They used the two terms interchangeably, which means that they felt that the two terms were synonymous. And Neanis, of course, just means young woman, and they thought that Parthenos meant the same thing. Now, if it was in a Gentile culture, obviously that would be wrong. If somebody from a particular region came over to where I am and said, I would like a Coke and I would like it to be, grape flavored, I'd look at them really strange because Coca-Cola ain't grape flavored, not by itself at least. You can have cherry Coca-Cola and things like that, but grape flavor would be a little bit weird. I'd be looking at them funny for a while. Because no, over here it's specific. When you say Coke, you mean Coca-Cola, and they'd be going, no, I just meant a carbonated beverage and I want it to be grape flavored. That's a real difference that happens, and it was a real difference that shows up in earlier languages as well, in earlier language groups. When you have different groups and different communities that have had time to develop independently of one another, and remember the introduction of Greek into the Middle East happened back in the 4th century, and of course the Septuagint is translated 100 to 200 years after that. You're going to get some differences in where the language has gone from that time point. Yes, the Greeks that brought it in would use it very specifically, but the people there, they didn't have the same culture. They didn't have the temple versions like the Greeks did. And yeah, there was definitely false religions that occurred in the Middle East and whatnot, but it wasn't the same culture, and so they didn't have the same context to fit it into. And so the word wound up generalizing and being something that could be used synonymously with other words. And that shows up in the Septuagint itself.
And that's what Matthew quotes in Matthew 1:23. So if you look up Parthenos, it's going to say virgin. If you look up Alma...
No, if you look up Parthenos, depending on the source, if you use a source that is linguistically sensitive, that is made from a linguistic point of view rather than a grammatical point of view, and like I said, I'm not knocking the grammatical point of view, because you do need to have rules in order to learn a language. I'm just saying that you shouldn't divorce the two. If you look it up in a linguistically sensitive lexicon, you will find that Parthenos isn't always virgin. Sometimes it can be translated as maiden, girl, young woman of marriageable age. And we see that in early translations like Tyndale, which got transposed into the Matthew's Bible, so on and so forth.
It's going to say young woman of marriageable age or a virgin. It can refer to a virgin. There is a specific term, Bethula, for a virgin. But in Isaiah 7, the emphasis is upon time frame in the initial fulfillment of the prophecy. Because what's it about? Well, if you remember, it's about the kings that have come against Israel, but by the time that this woman gives birth, those two kings will have gone away, and so that it's a time frame issue. When it becomes cited in the New Testament, it's no longer the time frame issue. The emphasis is upon the nature of the sign itself.
Yes, Emmanuel, God with us, that is very clearly the emphasis in the text, which is why Tyndale translated it as maid, and others would suggest maiden. because they understand that the reason why Matthew brought up the citation wasn't as a prediction of the virgin birth, but rather as a prediction of God being with us. Matthew didn't, as far as I can tell, Matthew didn't bring up this citation as a prediction of the virgin birth. He brought it up as a prediction that God was going to be with his people in a way like he had never been before. That there were all of these things in the Old Testament that had been happening, all these Old Testament patterns that were left unfulfilled. And now the fulfillment was coming. Okay, that was the point that Matthew was trying to get across that a Jewish audience would have understood. He did not seem to see the reference to Isaiah chapter 7 as being a prediction of the virgin birth. That wasn't the emphasis. And even as Dr. White has pointed out, in its original context, it wasn't a prediction of a virgin birth. It was very clearly not a prediction of a virgin birth. It was a prediction of a specific woman at that point in time, going all the way back in Isaiah, of a woman who did have children, a young woman, but a woman who wound up having children by natural means, being a sign. And that sign, though, of God being with us wasn't completely fulfilled at that time, because the children that she had were normal human beings. They were not Jesus Christ 1.0. They were normal human beings. That was the part that was unfulfilled, was the God with us part. But as far as the woman giving birth, yeah, that happened back then. And so there's no reason to believe that Matthew, speaking to a Jewish audience, would have seen the text as being a prediction of the virgin birth, but rather as being an unfulfilled promise of God being with us, which is what Matthew emphasizes. That's what he translates. Emmanuel, God with us.
Connected to Emmanuel, and that's when you then look at Emmanuel as it's used in Isaiah 7, and you follow all of the prophetic material from Isaiah 6 through Isaiah 11, and in each chapter you end up with messianic texts that are cited in the New Testament. So the New Testament writers see this concentrated area of messianic prophecy, and they're drawing from it in bits and pieces in the New Testament. And so all the stuff about Immaculate Conception, all the stuff about that's just completely out of relevance. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about. The Greek was in error. He was talking about a dispute over the semantic domain of Alma in the Hebrew, and
no, the semantic domain of Parthenos is actually disputable. And I would argue that if you're going to be linguistically sensitive to different areas using the same word in different ways, that the evidence would actually point towards Parthenos in Matthew, because it's from a Jew to Jews, that Parthenos would be better translated as maiden there. So even though Polite had absolutely no idea what he was doing, he did wind up stumbling upon something that was true. He was still wrong about the virgin birth because, like I said, the text goes out of its way to explain that. But regarding Matthew 1:23, turns out there was actually a basis for what he said.
And even then, the question then becomes, well, I don't know what his thing is. Maybe he doesn't believe Matthew's inspired, or I don't know. I have no earthly idea. If he does, then Matthew is utilizing the Greek Septuagint, and hence the meaning must be determined in that way. So,
and I would agree that the meaning of the Greek text is what was going to be important here. A lot of people argue, that the New Testament was originally written in Aramaic or in Hebrew and something like that and translated into Greek, and that's just absolutely bogus, and I've talked about that in other videos. But it is still true that a given word in a given language will have different meanings based on the region where it is being spoken. Like I said, Coke. Here, it means Coca-Cola product. Other places, it's just a carbonated beverage in general. Like I said, usually one of the darker ones, but not necessarily. And that's just a one of the idiosyncrasies of language. The same word can be used in different ways at the same time if the locations and the cultures are different. And Dr. White does not seem like he's ever run across that issue in language before. And I think it was because he was grammatically trained instead of balancing that grammatical training with linguistic training. I don't mean to insult him at all in that regard. I have a great amount of respect for him, and in so much as he has taught Greek courses before, I would suggest that if you can get a hold of him and actually take a Greek course from him, do it by all means. You're going to learn so much stuff, and it's going to be very useful. But understand that all of us have our limitations. Dr. White is a brilliant guy who studied a lot of things. He can't study everything, though. And so if he doesn't happen to pick up on some linguistic subtleties, that's not the biggest issue in the world. And I'm not bringing this up to say that he's an outright heretic or that he's made some colossal error. This is a very small detail in the grand scheme of things. I'm just simply pointing out so that Polite was actually technically correct about the translation here. He's still wrong about all of the implications, and he's still wrong about the conclusion that he draws as to whether Jesus was born of a virgin or not, because the text says, well, Mary says in the text, how can this be since I have never been with a man? I mean, it's really clear right there. But I'm just pointing out that technically Polite was correct on this one, and Dr. White, being a human being like all of us are, doesn't seem to have had all of the information or to look at all the information. He just doesn't have time to. That's just called being human. Even the smartest person in the world is still not going to know everything. But if there's anyone who comes close as far as Christianity is concerned, Dr. White would probably be the closest person that I know. Giving credit where credit's due here.
There you go. The problem is that kind of a statement carries a lot of weight with people for some reason, and the vast majority of people are not prepared to explain where the error is to be found. And it's a very clear error, and one that we should be aware of.
Okay, and that's pretty much it for reviewing Dr. White there. There was some stuff that he said before that, and of course there's the video calls that come afterwards where he starts talking about Dr. John Piper, and I'm just sitting there going, hey man, I'm glad somebody else caught on to some of the problems with what Dr. Piper has been saying. And I was very happy to hear that Dr. White was willing to call him out on that. He was still pretty nice about it, because Dr. White he's actually a pretty nice guy. But he still called him out for it and still said this is a problem, and I'm very happy about that. And I've been listening to Dr. White for years now, and this is the only time where I've ever felt the need to chime in and say something, and it's just because, no, technically you're wrong there. There are, in fact, reputable lexicons. By the way, Friberg's lexicon doesn't have the numbers in it. It's an actual lexicon that will list unmarried young woman as being the primary meaning. And by implication, that can mean virgin, but it can also just simply be maiden or a girl, a young woman. It's not a term that is necessarily unique in that way. And like I said, there was others that came way before the Fribergs did. There's Suter, Alexander Suter. There's William Tyndale. Those are probably the two most prominent ones. And then, depending on the source that Polite used, it might have been Strong's Concordance that listed it, but I don't know because I don't use Strong's Concordance, honestly. Strong's Concordance is pretty dated, and while it might be linguistically sensitive in some areas, it's not in others, and if you don't know anything about the language, it's just not really all that helpful. So I would suggest that you learn the language first before you look at any of these resources. Learn the language first. And I do have a Greek course online here on my channel that you can use and you can go through. You can get the books yourselves. Mounce's Interlinear and Mounce's Compact Guide, And you can download the materials that I provided in the links at the bottom of each one in the description boxes for each of my videos. And you can go through and you can teach yourself some of the basics of the Greek language. It's not going to be exhaustive by any means. It's not really enough to say that you really know Greek. It's just basically enough to know some resources and some about the language so that you don't, wind up getting yourself into too much trouble. But yeah, the less you know, the more trouble you tend to get yourself into. But at least gets you kind of past a certain hump. You can do that, and there's lots of other good courses that are out there. And of course, if you ever get the chance to actually study under Dr. White directly, do it. The guy is brilliant and very well trained, and he knows his stuff. This is just, I think, simply a case where he doesn't know everything, like all of us don't know everything. And there's a lot of things about the Greek language that he knows that I will probably never know because I just don't have the time. And there's some things that I know about a lot of things that he probably will never know either. I, for example, was primarily trained actually in mathematics. And I'm pretty sure that on a mathematics test, especially the more advanced mathematics, real analysis, those kinds of things, I could pretty easily whoop his little behind. But there's no reason to expect that he would ever enter that kind of a competition because that's not what he does. All of us have our areas of specialty, and linguistic analysis doesn't seem to be one of Dr. White's strong suits. Grammatical analysis, yes. Linguistic, not so much. And that, I would say, is a weakness in a lot of colleges' training when it comes to language in general, is that they tend to focus too much on the grammatical side and not enough on the linguistic side. My personal opinion. Dr. White, if you ever do wind up listening to this, and I have no idea if you ever will, but if you do, please know that I respect you, and I'm not at all saying that you're a heretic or anything like this. I just happen to think that you happen to miss it in this particular issue, and I can still completely agree with you that, Jesus was indeed born of a virgin. Fellow Reformed guy. Like I said, yeah, I'm on the Presbyterian side, you're on the Baptist side, but we agree on all that stuff. I just think that you overlook the fact that there are lexicons out there that do give translations other than virgin for Parthenos. And there are even translations that translate it other than virgin. And there are reasons for that. And I really do think that you need to pay more attention to those kinds of things in the future. But at the same time, I understand you're a busy guy and you don't have the time to look up every single thing like this. Okay, I understand, mistakes happen and those kinds of things. And you know what? You might still disagree with me at the end of the day and might favor the translation virgin still. And if you do, I'm pretty sure that we can still be Christian brothers on that one. But I did want to point out that there actually was at least a little bit of a basis to what Brother Polite was saying. Yeah, he's still got a lot of things wrong. The vast majority of it he still got wrong. But in that particular issue, I think that we need to be fair and say that, there actually is a possibility, at least from a certain point of view, that it might not technically be virgin. And that our argument for why we would say that Jesus was born of a virgin shouldn't rest just on that word, but rather we should look at the context of what else is said in Matthew, what else is said in Luke, and we should use that instead of relying on this one particular word that is very obviously in dispute. And to the rest of you guys who listen, please understand that I am in no way against Dr. White. Okay, I happen to disagree with him in this one area, and I would probably disagree with him in a few other areas. But it doesn't mean at all that I think he's any less of a Christian or any less of a scholar, or that I'm going to swear off his stuff from now on and never listen to anything he says. Not at all. I plan to continue watching and listening and learning and growing, as I would suggest that all of you do too. Okay, Christians can sharpen each other without hating each other. And in this modern age, we really need to get better at that. So thank you for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to an understanding of the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.